From Red Oak to Greenville, Bluefield to Orange, and Gold Vein to Silver Beach, the Virginia Press Room features the voices of Virginia's press corps from every corner of Virginia. The podcast is a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project and VPM News. Get the top headlines of the week and the inside scoop on Virginia politics when our top reporters open their notebooks and tell us the story behind the story. New episodes every Monday morning.
This is New Rural Virginia, reclaiming rural leadership through conversation featuring real voices, real issues from the heart of the Commonwealth. Well, hey, y'all, you're listening to New Rural Virginia podcast, and we're so thankful to have you here. I'm Parson Brown.
And I'm Larry Wohlers. We're your podcast host, and this is our last podcast before Thanksgiving, so we want to wish all of our listeners a really happy Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And a question for you, Parson.
Okay.
You hear that word Thanksgiving, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
I know it sounds generic, but it's totally a turkey for multiple reasons, not just the obvious.
You have different kinds of turkey you're thinking about?
The turkey was almost the national bird. I think about that sometimes. I don't bring it up during dinner, but it's like, man, how things could have been different. If turkeys were the national bird, Larry, they'd be off limits on Thanksgiving and probably endangered too, right by now. And would we be pardoning 2 bald eagles every year in that bizarro Thanksgiving world? Do eagles even have drumsticks? It's really a foul paradox.
Well, I could have lived without the turkey, but I could not have lived without the pumpkin pies. That's all I can say.
You are a pumpkin pie kind of guy.
Oh, I am. Absolutely. Ever since I was 5 years old. Haven't changed.
And another thing is when I was a kid, I actually called into a radio station. I made a turkey sound. I was the turkey for the area circa 1998. Kind of hurts a little bit. I have to shake my head around real.
Sorry, I missed that. Well, if we wanted to think about Thanksgiving from a historical basis,
We could do that.
we really should, right? And when they had that first Thanksgiving, as best as we can tell from history that's been rewritten several times, but I think we can say the good thing that was about Thanksgiving was people thinking that it was important to be a good neighbor. Right?
Yeah. And it depends on who you ask, and we want to be sensitive to the indigenous.
Absolutely. Today, we have with us someone who's with an organization that really represents that idea of being a good neighbor.
Yeah. We've got Lynlee Thorne from the Rural GroundGame, which is an incredible group of very good neighbors, and the work that they do is impressive.
Really impressive. And I don't think people always realize it because it's such an unusual organization. We're all used to thinking of organizations that think about politics as just showing up for an election and getting a vote and going away. But Rural GroundGame was created with the idea that rural Democrats need to be out there as real neighbors, as visible neighbors all the time.
Yeah, it's appropriately titled. They are responsible for organizing folks in the front lines of rural communities and a resource for so many candidates and organizations in rural spaces.
Exactly. And that's such an important idea. We're really pleased to have her with us today and hear her insights both about the election and where we go from here in terms of rural Democrats. So, Lynlee, glad that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump straight in. How did rural Democrats do this year in Virginia? And not just in terms of winning elections, but even more importantly, how did they do in terms of building and full consolidating rural Democrat as a movement in rural Virginia?
Yeah, I'm really glad you framed it that way because I look at elections a lot differently than the pundits do when we're talking about the horse race of election to election and
Exactly.
which political personality prevailed. There's a lot of commentary about that, but because rural Democrats are so deeply far behind bigger picture, it's really important to pay attention to what was built that isn't going to go away cycle to cycle. Electorally, across the board, Democrats did fantastic in rural areas. You know, we saw about rural Virginia, at least a 5 towards the Democratic cycle. That's fantastic. And then, of course, you see the outliers like Lily Franklin, where the rural parts of her district saw like an 8-point increase. We saw Gary Miller, who, outperformed Abigail Spanberger in large swaths of rural portions of his district. This story is in a number of rural districts, and that's all
That's right.
fantastic and wonderful. And what next? So we have to do this every year in Virginia. We never get a break. And so what I look to is, did we build any infrastructure? Was a new thing attempted and tried? And is there an interest in carrying that over into the next cycle immediately? Because that's really where we continue to build. And that has to be our focus. And I saw that on a number of fronts this year. A couple of things that we do at Rural GroundGame is work directly with local Democratic committees. The idea being that, these are our folks, these are our experts as Democrats across the Commonwealth. They're in their communities. They don't go away. They're focused on things that are happening. Like Parson here is paying attention to what's happening with the Samuels Library. These folks, this is the brain trust of our party, right? So investing in them and their work year round is really our primary goal, to continue to offer that support. So some things I've seen in the last few years are Democratic committees not waiting for their candidates to be ready to message, but they're like, we know we're going to buy these billboards. We're going to do these newspaper ads. We're going to run these radio ads. We're going to do this texting program. They're taking a much more proactive in campaign, partnering certainly in a state year, especially with their nominees, but going ahead and making those plans and raising that money to position themselves to have that message and not have to wait for a candidate to be ready to do that. I saw a lot of that this year. Brunswick County, Eastern Shore, far south, West Virginia, people were really ready to do that. And that's something that we assisted a lot of rural Democratic committees with this year, in addition to the direct support we offered to campaigns.
Yeah, thank you. I think we need to have more mention of the Rural Dem committees in this podcast, but it's just in general, because you're very right. It takes a lot of work, and your organization literally is called the Rural GroundGame, but that's a mindset too. And takes a lot to get a group of Democrats together and organized in Warren County. We've got a strong organization there, but it requires people to continue to show up and everybody contribute what they can. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. And I think, the rural retreat this last year, the rural caucus, as you know, kind of disappeared during COVID for a number of reasons and had a recent rebirth. And I think that was a great way to kick off the year earlier in the cycle. And for the last 2 years to have these really successful in-person gatherings of rural Democrats from a lot of regions of Virginia. Really important work there. And I recently attended the Young Dems Rural Caucus meeting, and I look at that as our long-term investment as well. And what I heard was incredibly smart folks who absolutely know what they're talking about when it comes to what needs to happen to move margins. And they're taking a look and really talking about districts that are like 80-20 Republican districts even now. And they're not turning away from that. They're actually having conversations about, okay, well, like what now? And that is unique, right? Because early in our party, we're not having a conversation about that at all. We're just kind of like, well, that is what it is. And we're going to keep it moving into, the urban crescent and these more competitive seats. They're looking towards a longer future, just like all rural Democrats have to look towards a longer future. We don't get the privilege of a cycle to cycle. Hey, we're going to slam dunk this one and win. We have to take a longer view of what progress like for us. And I see them doing that. And I see a lot of increase in their membership and engagement and folks leveling up to leadership roles. And that's really promising.
Note to self, Parson, that sounds like another podcast.
Oh, the Young Dems. I'm inspired and intimidated by how great they are, because I used to be one.
Yeah. So, Lynlee, you have an amazing project called The Storytellers, where you connect with the actual life situations of individuals around rural Virginia. What have you learned from that?
Yeah, to be honest, and I hope to take this to a more hopeful place, the Storyteller Project was a bit heartbreaking in the context of H.R. 1, Trump's awful bill, because what we were doing there is reaching out to people, talking about the coming cuts to Medicaid, Cardinal Care here in Virginia, the increased cost of Affordable Care Act plans, the increased cost of medical supplies and medication due to Trump's tariffs, and just the loss of rural healthcare facilities and emergency services. And if we want to have a future in these communities, that's very dark.
Yeah.
That's very heavy. And so we went and talked to people like Bill, who is very similar to my own father's. He is caring for his wife who has profound dementia. In his video, we did a long video with him and then we cut it into like a 30-second ad that we distributed to hundreds of thousands of voters in Virginia. And in his ad, he's talking about he knows he has enough money to maintain her care for 5 years. And then after that, he would have to shift her to a nursing facility that is Medicaid funded. Where will she go? He doesn't have an answer for that. We talked to Paul down in Danville. He had emergency amputation at the end of last year. His surgery, his medication, his in-home care is all Medicaid funded. This leaves him in a very chaotic state of despair, a lot of concern. So again and again, as we were interviewing people like Oma Jean out in Washington County, she talks about her husband passing away from black lung and why they had to move from Buchanan County to Washington specifically to be closer to a hospital because they didn't have the care that he needed in Buchanan. Just again and again, like these layers of, quite frankly, heartbreak. And some of that a result of Trump's bill, like generating a lot of chaos for people and not knowing what to expect for their future. And something that I think we have to recognize as a party is that the healthcare we were offering was becoming unaffordable for people across the board, you know, even before this bill came to pass. And so then what I want to be talking about is what do we do? You go and talk to these folks and you feel heartbroken and you're thinking about what resources you're aware of that you can point them to. That doesn't feel like enough. We know we have to fix this and that's going to be hard. And we had these sweeping victories across Virginia for Democrats this year. And now the hard work of governing is about to begin. And we have got a hell of a task in front of us to take care of people. And part of the Storyteller Project is to put real people at the center of our policy, to say we can look at facts and figures and charts to talk about what's happening. But if you just sit down and hear what's going on with Paul, with Willie, with Andrea, with Sherry, the stories become real. And the policy, the way that we govern, we are hopefully in better touch with how this impacts real people and their lives. And my hope is that as Democrats, because we're communicating through these stories, we're saying we care enough to go and bear witness to the truth of what is happening in people's lives. And then now we feel a moral responsibility to show up to Richmond and DC and do right by these folks and make life better. That is our job. And it is a heavy task right now. And there's really no way to glaze over that or make that seem less daunting than it is.
That is so true. Just bringing the reality, rural reality of our neighbors and folks and presenting that to, if we could get our leaders to pay more attention, because you're taking on, it's a burden, but such good work, because to hear people's stories, if you listen to some of the folks that you've talked to throughout our communities, how can you hear their stories and not be moved?
Yeah.
And it's important work. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And jump in there. I think this is an area, Parson, where we could do really a whole series of podcasts, because the problem with our healthcare system is we're not only letting individuals down by not taking care of their healthcare needs and hurting their communities because of that, but we have a healthcare system that is unaffordable for the country as a whole. Right. Just a bizarre situation that demands much more thoughtful and comprehensive solution.
We're not taking care of ourselves, and we can't take care of our neighbors, then we can't take care of our communities. So it just goes on, and we're all connected in that way. We got to support one another. So to build on the gains in attention to that Dems have had in rural Virginia, what are the priorities of Richmond right now? There are allies, but a bit of a disconnect sometimes between rural Democrats and the rest of our party and the Democrats that are sitting in Richmond and DC.
That is correct. But I do think, before I talk about Richmond, I just want to mention quickly, because I do think this is key to the big picture for rural Democrats. What we've seen is about a 3% total investment of Democratic dollars going into rural communities. This is not specific to Virginia, but 3%. Yeah, this is a rural organizing study. I'll share with y'all. Great folks at Rural Organizing did this study a few years back.
I was going to say that much.
Right. And, you know, we as an organization, we're like, look, man, we're part of the team, right? And we understand why we would invest so much in these competitive competitive races to secure the powerful majority that Democrats now have in the General Assembly. Like, this is fantastic. And we support that wholeheartedly. And I actually believe that our party is coming to a place at the highest levels of understanding that you can't win nationally or even statewide without rural Democrats. It simply isn't possible. In 2020, when we came up short, rural Virginia simply outvoted Northern Virginia. And we've corrected that this cycle. And I also want to point out the fact that, Speaker Don Scott reached out to me months ago and recognized that we were, doing some work that he appreciated. He invested in our work this year. State Party Chair Lamont Bagby has been very supportive and communicative with us. And remarkably, he also invested in our work this year. That's a huge shift. That is at least a recognition of, we want to see this change. We want to partner with rural Democrats, and that's going to mean more than just words. So wanted to point that out. I do think seeing that kind of shift. And I think, from what I've seen in terms of the legislation being presented by Democrats ahead of the General Assembly session, is they're very focused on affordability. That word is kind of won the day. I personally don't love that word because I feel like most normal people don't go around saying affordability, but
Yes,
we are on a politics podcast, so we'll go ahead and use it. But we're seeing things like an increase in the minimum wage. This is an obvious one that Democrats should be working on. That's on the docket, and hopefully will be successful. I think that will be helpful. But kind of to your point, Larry, we want to go beyond just making life affordable and go towards prosperity. But this is a really important and necessary step to get us there. I see bills on affordable housing. I'm seeing a repeal of right to work, which I would love to see go all the way through. I'm seeing a lot of focus on making daily life better and more affordable for Virginians across the board. I'm seeing Democrats be very, very focused on that in the way that they're moving forward for their plans in Richmond.
Is it a matter of messaging or affordability? But then you use the word prosperity and hit me in a different way. And I think maybe, again, we do talk about politics all the time, but something that we've heard from other folks as well is we're in a new era of experimenting and trying to implement messaging that reaches rural voters, not just Democrats, but rural voters, and trying to test those waters and get our points across. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really another piece of the Storyteller Project, is to get someone like me, or even, no offense to them, even our candidates, kind of out of the way of the message and let regular people who are simply just telling the truth of their lives in a very authentic way, and eliminating some of the jargon that we might use while we're talking about this in this space, which is appropriate and normal. But what is the actual message that the majority of voters are going to hear? And I would rather them hear Oma Jean's voice that sounds like Southwest Virginia, because she is Southwest Virginia. And I would like people to hear, the voices of these other folks who sound like their community because they are of their community. And I think as far as Rural GroundGame is hosting a town hall, a pre-session town hall in Harrisonburg, Virginia on January 7th. And the purpose of that is simply to show that, yes, we won the election, and we recognize that we still need to be in community. We might have gotten enough votes to secure statewide victories and a strong majority in the House, and the work isn't done. Still going to be out here listening to folks and hearing what they have to say before we go into the General Assembly and pass laws that will impact them. I hope to do a lot more of that. So we'll have some members of the General Assembly, as well as Democratic nominee this year for House District 34, Andrew Payton, who came up just 250.
That's right.
Shy of a victory, and give the community an opportunity to talk to these folks before they go to Richmond. I think if I could ask our party and our party leaders and elected officials to do one thing when it comes to rural, it would be include rural people at the design phase of everything you do. I am watching solar farms get killed all over rural Virginia. In my own community, I think we've killed at least 5, and there's a new one being proposed in Timberville. People are getting really animated about this, and I'm reading what people are saying about it, and it's the same thing every time. It's like a solar company comes in. Often they are donating to Democratic politicians, by the way, and they're coming into the community and they're like, we bought this land, here's what it looks like, and now we're going to ram it down your throats. We're going to have BS public meetings and tell y'all to get right. This is happening. And that pisses people off.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I think the things that we need to do as a party, when we think like we're doing right by people, we have all this great policy, we're taking care of folks, it's like, but do it on their terms. Go
Right.
and talk to them, get community buy-in, and make it a partnership, genuinely collaborative partnership where stakeholders in community get to be part of the design phase of any policy that they are going to see come to fruition in their town. That would change the landscape enormously. And I think really beat back on the narrative that Democrats are kind of elitist who, thinks rural people don't vote their interest. It's like people's first interest, I think their primary interest is to be seen. Is to be
Yes.
seen.
Yes.
Frontline rural communities, they are the experts in their own story. And
Right.
so nobody wants to be told what's best for them. So if we remind people that they are the expert in their own story and then empower them to connect and that they're not alone, I think that could go a really long way. It's important to remind our friends beyond rural Virginia in Richmond that we're here and our neighbors need to be
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah.
Well, I think solar is a great example of the disconnect between urban and rural people because urban folk just want solar as consumers. They don't care how it's produced, whereas for rural folks, it matters a lot. And if you had a system where every farmer would have support to put in 10 or 20 acres of solar if they wanted to, and then keep all the revenues from that instead of having these big industrial farms where all the revenues go to some corporate boardroom.
Yep.
I think attitudes towards solar would change quickly.
I would
But
in a heartbeat at my own farm.
Right.
I have tons of very conservative neighbors who have solar panels on at their farms.
absolutely.
And that is how they're
Mhm.
pumping water from the ground. It's like they are getting further and further off grid and have a much more sustainable energy solution for their farms. But they have designed those. They have designed them in a way where they're protected from cattle if they have them, or
Exactly.
I prefer to raise sheep. You have to do that in a certain way, but you can plant native species around these. Like you can do so many different things.
Right.
If you empower the farming community to be part of this and not impose this on them and take farmland away. And
Exactly.
a lot of other problems like erosion and just the list goes on.
Yeah.
But we can get what we want and we can have these partnerships with rural communities, but consistently we are choosing to say, this is for your own good, or this is just something we need. And we're prepared to sacrifice your communities for what our communities need, when really we should be in partnership with each other because our communities need a lot of the same things. And as Democrats
That's
have
right.
bills on affordable housing, we need affordable housing in rural communities. I think that surprises a lot of folks in the cities and suburbs that we also have that problem.
That
And-
people live here.
Right. So a lot of
Absolutely.
abilities for partnership. And my hope is that if we can continue to share these stories through our Storyteller Project, and this is also a hopeful thing. Jennifer McClellan and Representative McClellan and Senator Danica Rome did a press call a few weeks ago, and it was when the SNAP cuts were happening and there was a lot of uncertainty and fear there. And they brought on someone that we know in community that organizes a food bank, the River City Bread Basket down in Waynesboro, and had them on that call to hear those voices. A few weeks later, we had another guy, Ron, who credits the Affordable Care Act for saving his, and he was elevated to a press call with Senator Warner. So I do think we are finding ways to get these storytellers in rural communities positioned in front of our Democratic legislators, and where we have some of them saying, we want to hear from these people. We recognize
Right.
we need to. And I think that is another hopeful thing about what we can do. And we can't do this alone. Like we called over 358,000 rural Virginians this year who hadn't voted in at least 2 of the last 4 elections. We started calling them in April, all the way until we started making GOTV calls at the end of September. And we were calling about the cuts to Medicaid. And again, these are not regular voters, right? And they're not consistently showing up to participate in elections. And 526 of them offered to tell personal stories about their own healthcare and that of their loved ones.
Rural areas, our farmland, our open spaces, our rivers, we're more than just pretty places to visit. We're more than just somewhere to plop down a solar farm. And I think that is something that doesn't resonate with folks in urban areas too. We absolutely need to be part of those conversations
Right.
and part of the plan.
Well, that's a great segue into another theme that we have is the Republicans like to say they are the party that's pro-business. with the implication that the Democrats are not, right? But there are, generally speaking, two kinds of businesses. There are small businesses of small farmers who really want a level playing field, want to be able to fairly compete, and need government to ensure that. And then there are the big corporations which want to be left alone to squelch competition, right? Because if you're a big corporation, you don't want competition. You want to continue to maintain your monopoly. And when the Republicans say they're pro-business and therefore saying government shouldn't be involved, what they're really saying is they're pro-big business. We've seen results of that over 40 years in rural areas, right, where big business controls chickens and the pork and the cattle and the food. And that ends up being a situation where rural areas produce everything, but the profits don't stay at home. Do you think the Democratic Party can be the voice, small business and family farmers, that the Republicans really are no longer?
I hope so. I think one thing there, Larry, is it's really important for us to figure out a way to communicate that the government is involved in propping up those big monopolies. And the way they're communicating about it is BS. The subsidies to farmers to pay for the feed, because they aren't competing. This isn't free market economy. It's propped up. And all their workers if it's Walmart or Pilgrim's Chicken or George's, a lot of those workers are dependent on SNAP. They're dependent on Medicaid. They need these programs because they aren't being paid appropriately for their labor. And that is its own problem. I think that is why I would like to see Democrats return to being champions for the working class and I know this will be contentious in Virginia this year, but right to work is a racist Jim Crow law.
Right.
And if we're in a moment in our country where authoritarianism is not a threat, it is real. It is happening. It is here right now in this moment. And I think we are having to make the choices to really be brave and be courageous. And if we say we are for working people, then we need to be for working people in a real way. So I hope to see us make great gains to advance organizing. You're seeing that a lot, particularly in a lot of the voters that we lost in 2024. In young people in immigrant communities, you're seeing a lot of push for organizing their workplace, which I think would be a really healing thing for these big businesses that you talked about and these monopolies. I think the most powerful thing we can do to change that is to give people real power, real meaningful power. And if we are just up here saying, yep, we're on your side, we want to help break the barriers for you to be able to organize in your workplace and fight for what you deserve, rather than say, we'll just do it for you. Let's empower you to get this done with your coworkers. We're missing a huge opportunity if we don't do that. And I think for rural communities in particular, that would be transformative. And I think we also know that small businesses are the lifeblood of a small community. And I got to hang out with Person. Was that last year, Person? I'm like missing my years. When we were in Norton.
Yeah. You met, I was meeting with some folks with the Alliance for Appalachia in Norton, and that was a great time. Actually, Yeah,
it was very fun. Person and I got to play around in a creek and literally built a bridge.
We had to build a bridge out of some logs. Look, there was a group of Appalachians, some rural Virginians who put in their heads together. Yeah, it was more like we were kind of beaverish that day.
Yeah. It's wonderful. And thinking about a prosperity agenda, for me, it's easier to digest through stories, which is probably why I'm passionate about the Storyteller Project. Yep. Tabitha and her husband in Appalachia were part of this 2-day thing that Parson and I participated in. And she is reinvesting in this town of Appalachia, partnering with local people to bring businesses back to, kind of went dormant for a long time, which I think is a very recognizable trend in a lot of small towns and rural communities. And I look to people like her to be like, what is she doing? How is she making this happen to revive her town? And then what partnerships does she need from Richmond and from DC to make that happen in that community? Not to do it for her, but to make sure that the people there are getting what they need, because they have a vision. They know what they want to do.
Yeah.
And that would feel like a place where people might want to stay and might want to raise a family and might see a future for themselves. So there are people in these communities with vision for what they could look like, and they're still hopeful and they're still dreaming. And whatever we can do to facilitate that and go hear them out and say, what do you need from Richmond? What do you need from DC? And let us be partners to you in that effort. That's what I want to see. And that's kind of what I think about when I think about how do we build that prosperity for rural communities.
Yeah, partners. Because if we don't get involved, if we don't be part of the organizing and the discussion, and we don't make choices for our communities, then they will be made for us. And
it becomes very easy to blame people who we don't have connection to, or it's easy to vilify immigrants and people who don't, maybe share the background if we don't have those partnerships and if we aren't looking to local people to have the open conversation, because that's where a lot of the distrust is allowed to fester, is when we lose that connection. And there's a lot of great people out there doing it. I think it's on us as a party and our elected leaders and other folks, and for organizers like us on the ground to say, hey, here's an opportunity for you to come and listen to this community. And just assume best intentions of our party and our elected leaders. Maybe they just need an invite. Maybe it takes the rest of us organizing and creating those opportunities for them to come in and be humble and receive what they can hear from the community.
So what I think I'm hearing is that the Democratic Party could be the voice of rural prosperity, both for workers and for small business and family farms, right? But I don't think a lot of rural people believe that yet, right? So that's a message that we have to push harder and that Richmond has to keep in mind. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And, we have these people in rural communities, a lot of the candidates who ran this year and a lot of other local elected officials who are members of school board or sitting on their town council. Tyler Hughes comes to mind, down there in Big Stone Gap. People love Tyler, and he keeps being reelected because people trust him. He is a Democrat, and they don't care because they know Tyler. They know his They know what he cares about because he's made that very clear his entire life. And anything that we can do to really invest in those folks and let them be the messengers, and then create opportunities for Democrats in other areas to come and listen. But really, they should see, the Tabithas and the Joy Powers and the Venables and these folks as those should be our communicators. They have more credibility than the party, but they're part of the party. And as long as we make that clear, then we are actively expanding our party into these places with credible and trusted messengers.
Yeah, and Tyler Hughes was just added to Governor-elect Spanberger's transition team. So very optimistic about having his voice there too.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation, Lynlee.
Yeah, thank you all for your time.
Well, we are thankful for you, for all your work that you do, and for joining us. And looking forward to continuing to hear the stories that you're capturing and working together with you and your organization for a more prosperous Virginia.
Thanks.
And my last question is, Lynlee, what is your favorite dish for Thanksgiving dinner?
Oh, the pressure. I'm going to be boring and it's always mashed potatoes for me.
That's good mashed potatoes, yes.
Just a comfort food. I have strong feelings about it. They got to be made in a certain way. And
lots of butter?
Yeah, but cooked separately. So there's potatoes that are cooked in the chicken stock.
Okay.
Some with some thyme and other herbs, like boiled in the stock, not just in water. And then making the butter cream herb in a separate thing and then folding those in.
Okay, the amount of thought that's put into this now makes it sound even more delicious. Yeah, that's not boring. That's a foundation.
Okay, Parson, we need a food podcast here.
Oh, don't even get me started.
Okay, well, Lynlee, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. And have a really happy Thanksgiving with your family.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks for what y'all do.
Thank you.
And you know what, Larry? One more thing that I'm really thankful for is everybody that has worked so hard and organized on the ground in rural Virginia, especially this past year with these elections. And I'm also extremely thankful to our listeners for tuning in and connecting with us and following New Rural Virginia podcast.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. This has been such a treat for us to be able to create this podcast, to talk with everybody, to learn, and have just a good time with everyone. So thank you.
Yeah. New Rural Virginia Podcast, Conversations about Rural Virginia's Future, is a product of New Rural Virginia. Visit newruralva.org for more. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow us. We're available anywhere you get your audio. For deeper dives into the topics we cover, catch additional insights and stories on the Rural Angles Substack newsletter. This program is produced by Larry Wohlers and yours truly, Parson Brown. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode.